So, okay, I hope that everyone got the Makorot. There was a bit of a scheduling switch. So I was this topic of the show I only found out yesterday. I was going to be teaching today as opposed to next week. So this is a rebroadcast, if you will. Though the last time I gave this topic was 5 years ago, and it was before the age of Zoom. But I'm going to be focusing on a very broad question, a very important question, I think, in terms of our understanding of Torah, and specifically a klal which Chazal speak of and is proven from this week's parsha, she'en Mukdam Umeuchar BaTorah, that when we speak of the things in the Torah, we do not necessarily expect the Torah to present things chronologically. And we'll get to why we learn that from this week's parsha in just a couple of minutes. But this idea, I think, also touches upon a much broader idea, a philosophical idea, if you will, in terms of our understanding of time in general. And I think that once we have a better appreciation for what I think, at least, Chazal understood by that concept of Ein Mukdam Umeuchar BaTorah, I think that we can have a much broader and deeper, at the same time, understanding of what's going on in the Torah as a whole, and perhaps even beyond that, to go, if one could say, beyond Torah, to understand what's going on in our own lives. And with that, I guess I've staked out a pretty big claim by saying that. So with that, though, I want to take a look at the Makorot. Let me just share the screen with you. And hold on just one moment. Okay, does everyone see it? Yes?
Yes.
Okay, great. So so here I'll make it even a little bit larger. So I just want to take a focus, one second. There we go. So if we can now take a look at the at this. So the one second, let's get it to the okay. That's I guess the best size.
Fine, that's fine.
So in this week's parsha, right? So we have in the middle of the parsha, we have the story of what's known as Pesach Sheni, and the story I'm sure is familiar to many of you. The Torah tells us how in the desert, and I just brought the first two psukim of the parak here. By Daber Hashem el Moshe b'midbar Sinai b'shana shenit l'tzeit tam me Eretz Mitzrayim. So the Torah tells us that it is now the second year that they have left, b'chodesh harishon, and it's the first month. So exactly 1 year has transpired since Yitziat Mitzrayim, and the Torah tells us Vayasu b'nei Yisrael et haPasach b'moado. And so on this date, the Torah, the Bnei Yisrael, here it's the 14th of Nisan in the second year, 1 year to the day when they left Egypt. It's been quite an eventful year. When you think about it, it's Yitziat Mitzrayim, it's the been Matan Torah, it has been the Egel, it has been everything coming, the recuperation from the Egel, the building of the Mishkan. The Mishkan is dedicated on Rosh Chodesh of the first of Nisan in the second year. And so in that very eventful year, now we are starting year 2, and we have the Korban Pesach. Vayasu b'nei Yisrael et haPasach, so b'nei Yisrael did the Pesach. The only problem with this is a wonderful story, and then of course the Torah continues and tells us about those people who were Tmei Met. They were unable to bring the Korban, and they come to Moshe with their legitimate complaint that they're not going to be able to bring the Korban Pesach. What should they do? And the response of the Ribono Shel Olam is what we know as Pesach Sheni, that they're going to have the opportunity in the second month, in the 14th of Iyar, to bring a korban as well. The story itself is a very important story and is well known. The only problem with it is the placement here in the Torah, because you would expect it to be at the beginning of the Sefer, the beginning of Sefer Bamidbar, 9 prakim earlier. The Torah tells us, "Vaydaber Hashem Moshe b'Midbar Sinai b'Ol Moed be'achad chodesh hasheni b'shana hasheni." So here we have the second month. The second month of the second year. In other words, this is the story of the 8 prakim that we've been reading until now, in terms of the census, in terms of the setting up of all of the encampment with the Degalim, the 4 sides, the Leviim, everything that is mentioned in the Torah throughout the course of the Parsha, or the Parshiot that we've been reading, Bamidbar and Nasa, and the beginning of Baalotcha, happens in actuality a month later than the story of the Korban Pesach. And here the Torah tells us that the Korban Pesach was brought in the first month. And here there's no escape from the recognition that the Torah here is not speaking chronologically, because the Torah gives us the dates and tells us quite explicitly that the incident which is being presented first is actually happening second, and the incident that happened second is actually happened first. So here we have an idea of ein Mukdam Umeuchar BaTorah. Now the Midrash Halacha quite early on picks up on this, and the Sifrei tells us here in the first source, "Vaydaber Hashem al Moshe b'Midbar Sinai b'shana hashenit l'tzeitam me'eretz Mitzrayim b'chodesh Limor." So first, the Midrash begins with an explanation that which Rashi is going to expand upon, and I'm going to give it perhaps a different twist to it. B'gnut Yisrael hakatuv midaber. The Torah is speaking of Bnei Yisrael negatively. B'gnut Yisrael. Now, exactly what is that gnut? The Torah, the Midrash doesn't quite tell us. Rashi is going to give an explanation. But then the Midrash continues and says, Ulalam decha. And this is supposed to teach you something. She'en mukdam umeuchar BaTorah. This teaches us that there is no necessarily chronological order in the Torah. שבתחילת הספר הוא אומר, וידבר שם משה במדבר סיני באוהל מועד באחד לחודש השני, וכאן הוא אומר בחודש הראשון. So here the Torah has given us the dates, and they flip the dates. L'lamdecha. Now, as you can see, I've put in bold the word l'lamdecha, and I think it's a very important word, because the Torah here, the Midrash here is I think is staking out a claim. It's saying that here we have a something which is going to be a general rule that you can employ, and that it's not just a one-time fluke that we have this chronological gap, but that this is something which you can use or expect to see in other places as well. L'lamdecha, this teaches you. She'en mukdam umeuchar BaTorah. Rabbi Omer, eno tzarich. Rabbi tells me, I don't need this. Kfar ne'amar, v'bnei Yisrael achlu et haman 40 shana ad boam ad aretz no shavet. V'adayin lo achalu. El lamdecha she'en mukdam umeuchar BaTorah. Rabbi Yehuda Nasi here is referring to a pasuk back in Sefer Shmot, in Parshat Bishalach, where the Torah tells us, after the description of the man, that the man first falling, that the Bnei Yisrael ate the man for 40 years until they came to the promised land. or more literally, the settled land, the Eretz no Shavet. Now, and of course, they haven't eaten it for 40 years because, if that was part of the Torah in back in Parshat B'Shalach, if that Moshe was reading that in the first year, in the first month, really, because after all, the man began to fall in the Nisan of the first year. So then, there should have been a spoiler alert, splashing across the screen that they're going to be stuck in the Midbar for 40 years. So obviously this pasuk is written after the fact and then introduced in the Torah. Now, the response, the Midrash doesn't give a response to Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. Perhaps it's not so important. There's a difference between the two cases. There, it's true that the Torah is telling us something that happened later, but it's not presenting events in an ongoing way. In other words, to say that the Torah has if you will, an editing layer that occurs in the let's say that Moshe puts in the last month before they go into Eretz Yisrael. So then, okay, that's a possibility. But here, the order that the Torah is presenting the events is out of order. So it's true that you could say the concept of Ein Mukdam Umeuchar BaTorah already rears its head there in Parshat B'Shalach, but it's here it's being applied in, as I said, on a different order altogether. Be that as it may, now it could be that since we're dealing with the idea, just to mention that it's l'lamdecha, to get back to that word, that we have this notion that the Torah does not work chronologically necessarily, and I want to focus on that. I want to emphasize that word necessarily. We'll talk about it a little bit more in a moment. But the fact that the Torah is, and it's a phenomena which is going to go throughout the Torah. So and I can apply it in my learning of the Torah. So it could be that Rabbi Yehuda Nasi's idea of the from the man is going to be sufficient, but that we'll leave that aside for the moment. We have the concept. Rashi, as I said, takes this midrash and he brings it in his perush here. So Rashi says, "B'chodesh harishon pasha shebirosh hasefer lo ne'emra ad iyar lamad she'en seder mukdam umeuchar BaTorah." So Rashi says this tells me that there isn't a chronological order. So the question now becomes, "V'lama lo patach b'zo?" So why did we not indeed begin with here? In other words, Rashi isn't satisfied. With the idea to simply say, and I can say that all it means is that the Torah doesn't work chronologically, and I don't have to ask the question why. Rashi himself, by the way, might give me that kind of hint. Rashi in his Perush in the Gemara, when the Gemara takes this medrash that we just saw here in number 4, and the Gemara in Pesachim references the medrash that we just learned. The Torah there says, "V'nichtov b'reisha d'chodesh rishon v'hadar nichtov d'chodesh sheni." Amar Rav Menashe bar Tachlifa Mishmei Zot emeret ein mukdam umeuchar BaTorah. So this is so it quotes the idea, and what is Rashi? Rashi first explains the reference, which we're not going to take a look here. If you're taking a look at on the left hand of the table, Rashi says, Ein mukdam umeuchar. So here's his definition of it. Lo hikpida Torah al seder mukdam umeuchar uparshot dene'emru tchila hikdimu hameucharot la. So here Rashi gives a way of looking at it as basically saying, 1 second, I don't know why here we go. So Rashi basically says that lo hikpida Torah, it's a funny word, lo hikpida Torah, that the Torah doesn't care about. Now that's let me just change that color just for a second. I'm sorry. The Torah doesn't care about the order. Now that's something which is, we could understand a Mukdam Umeuchar BaTorah in that way, namely that once I create this concept that the Torah does not necessarily work chronologically, so maybe I'll take out the word necessarily. The Torah doesn't work chronologically, and you can find incidents which occurred earlier, and vice versa, and it just shouldn't bother you. In that, the already in the Gemara, the Gemara limits it. The Gemara says, "Amar of Papa lo amran el betray inyane aval bechad inyane my de mukdam my de muuchar." The Torah is saying that this concept, or excuse me, the Gemara is saying when we apply the concept of ein mukdam umuchar BaTorah, this lack of chronology in the Torah, we can only apply it if you're talking about two different parshiot, if you're talking about two different chapters, two different stories, etc., but not within it's not free verse. It's not going to be something where you are not expecting one pasuk to follow the next pasuk in a chronological order. To borrow a quip from Rav Mordechai, I heard it from Rav Mordechai Breuer Zatzal. Other people may have heard it from other people, but when he was talking about this is not within the context of the Torah, but in the context of the Sifrei Emet, the three Sfarim that begin Ketuvim, Tehillim, Mishlei, and Iyov, but they are as the acronym of Emet, Iyov, Mishlei, Tehillim, in order to remember it. So he quipped once that when you're reading Sefer Tehillim, you shouldn't expect one parak to be related to the next parak, and in Sefer Mishlei, you shouldn't expect one pasuk to be related to the next pasuk, and in Iyov, you shouldn't expect one word to be connected to the following word. Okay, but here in Torah, at least, when I come to one pasuk following another pasuk, so you should expect the chronology to hold. The ilote mahachi, and it's very interesting why. The ilote mahachi klal uprat en bichlal al masha prat dilma prat uklalhu. We have the 13 rules that we are familiar with because we say them in the Shachrit every morning. That the rules of how to make drashot and there's a difference between if a general rule follows a detail or if the detail follows the general rule. But if you say that ein mukdam umeuchar BaTorah, so then you're saying that it's Jabberwocky. It doesn't matter what the order is. And so if it doesn't matter what the order is, so then you can never apply the rules of drash. Now, this is actually kind of interesting because here the Gemara at least is positing is positing here that you can have it's not just chronology, right? We're saying because Klal Uprat doesn't talk about incidents and stories; it talks about the halachot, and so we're basically saying ein mukdam umuchar BaTorah. It's not only a question of chronology; it's a question of the order of the Torah doesn't make a difference. And if I say that the order of the Torah doesn't make a difference, then I could go so far as to say that it doesn't make a difference in when I'm dealing with halachic sections as well. So Rav Papa doesn't even say that that's an impossibility. He simply says that we have to be careful when we do that because we have other rules of making drashot, and in order for the drashot to work, we need the order of the text to be in the proper order. Again, not chronology, because if we're dealing with a legal section, So then it's ahistorical and doesn't necessarily refer to a chronology, but the order of the Torah has to hold there. But anyway, we'll come back to that point, but getting back to what Rashi had said, Ein Mukdam Umeuchar BaTorah. So this is the way that many people frequently understand it, is that there isn't necessarily an order to the Torah. There isn't necessarily a chronology to the Torah. And if there isn't an order, if I don't expect the order, then I don't even have to ask the question necessarily, why is the order being changed? I'll just have to take the principle that the Torah doesn't have that. Rashi, in our Perush of Rashi and on the Chumash, so he isn't willing to go that far. Because at least not in our case, Lama patach lo patach bizo. Rashi just simply says, okay, if it's true that Ein Mukdam Umeuchar BaTorah, it's not random and it's not arbitrary. There has to be some kind of explanation as to why. What is the reason why in these cases we don't say Ein Mukdam Umeuchar BaTorah? And so the answer is Mipnei shehu gnutan shel Yisrael shekol 40 shana shayu Yisrael bamidbar lo hikrivu ela pesach zeh bilvad. So here Rashi wants to say that his understanding of the first that line in the Sifrei, that the idea is that if you were to have started with this, so then if this had been the opening to Bamidbar, and if you think about it, it follows directly. It's not even a question of what comes first in Sefer Bamidbar, but what is the order of the Torah as a whole. It's important to note this, that when we talk about Sefer Shemot, so if we ask I'll ask you all a trick question, and I would say, okay, what follows Sefer Shemot? So, of course, we would all say that what follows Sefer Shemot is Sefer Vayikra. That's half right. The truth is that if you think about it, and now is not the time to really get into it in too much detail, but Sefer Shemot forks into two directions. Sefer Shemot has two continuations: the ahistorical, the legal continuation, namely the last story in Sefer Shemot, in Perek Mem of Sefer Shemot, is the dedication of the Mishkan, and how Moshe erects the Mishkan, and how the Shekhinah comes into this into the Torah right there, into the Mishkan right there. That's on Rosh Chodesh Iyar of the second year. The Torah continues in Sefer Vayikra with what happens with the Shekhinah in the Mishkan, namely the giving of further halachot of what we call Torat Kohanim, the halachot of the Mishkan. And obviously, there's much more in Sefer Vayikra, but that's the core, if you will. What happens in the Mishkan itself? But there's another branch, and that branch is parallel. That's not the ahistorical branch, but rather the historical branch. What happened the day after? What happens in the next day of the after the Mishkan is erected? The storyline of the second year, and obviously continuing to year 40, which is at the end of Sefer Bamidbar, what happens during those 39 years? And that is the story of Sefer Bamidbar. That's the continuation of Sefer Shemot. And if you look carefully at the psukim in the Sefer, it's not here on the sheet, but I'll just read the last few psukim of Sefer Shemot, and you see it very clearly there. I wasn't planning on doing this, so I apologize for the delay. And so here the Torah says the following. The last four psukim point out this split. If you these are the last four psukim of Sefer Shemot. Vayichas ha'anan et Ohel Moed uchvod Hashem maleh et hamishkan. So the cloud covered the Ohel Moed, and the glory of God filled the Mishkan. V'lo yachol Moshe lavo el Ohel Moed, ki shachan alav ha'anan uchvod Hashem maleh et hamishkan. Moshe cannot come into the Mishkan because the Mishkan is filled with the Shekhinah. Next pasuk is referring to what the Mishkan does not, excuse me, what does the Shekhinah do for, not for Moshe and in terms of divine revelation, but for the travels of Bnei Yisrael. And the imlo ya'alehanan, if the cloud did not arise, so then lo yisu ad yom ha'alata, they wouldn't travel until the day that it did. Ki anan Hashem al mishkan yomam ve'esh tiyeh layla ki leinei kol beit Yisrael v'chol masehem. So the Torah and those last few psukim of Sefer Shemot is making the split. The first couple of psukim is referring to what the Mishkan will mean for Sefer Vayikra, and the subsequent psukim talk about what the Mishkan means and the Shekhinah, for Sefer Bamidbar. So we come to the very next day, back to Rashi, and Rashi says, "Lama lo patach bezo." If the next story after Aleph Nisan is when the Mishkan is erected, the last parak of Sefer Shemot, and now the very next story is how Bnei Yisrael come and bring the Korban Pesach, so then I would get the impression that things are wonderful, and we have the Korban Pesach, and perhaps it continues every subsequent year after that when they're in the desert, and that's not the case. The Korban Pesach was brought in year 2 and will not be brought again until the first year that they enter Eretz Canaan, some 39 years later with Yehoshua. This is the last time they bring the Korban Pesach. And so Rashi says the reason for the Torah moving this story 9 prakim in is to let us know, is to hint to the fact that this is not really the way that it might be chronologically, the way the Mishkan was operating the first year, but it's not the way it was operating throughout the Midbar, and Bnei Yisrael is responsible for that. Bnei Yisrael is responsible perhaps because of the Chet of the Meraglim, because of the spies, perhaps because they had an opportunity even after the spies to continue bringing the Korban Pesach, and they don't want to bring the Korban Pesach for whatever the reason. That's not our issue right now, but because it never had occurred again, that's something which is to the denigration of Am Yisrael, and we don't want to open the Sefer with that story. The Ramban, who in general, and now I'll just point this out, and this is something that many of you may be familiar with already. In general, Rashi is more, and others as well, not just Rashi, the Ibn Ezra, are more willing to apply Ein Mukdam Umeuchar BaTorah than other Mefarshim. Most famously, the Ramban. The Ramban is aware, obviously, of this idea of Ein Mukdam Umeuchar BaTorah, and he can't deny it because, after all, the Torah in our parsha is making it very clear with the in terms of the chronology by placing the chronology differently. However, the Ramban in general tries to limit it to cases where it's almost impossible to understand the Torah without using this principle of Ein Mukdam Umeuchar BaTorah. So, for example, when it comes to this is perhaps the most famous example, the question of in the last half of Sefer Shemot, where we have the discussion of the the tzivui and the implementation of building the Mishkan. When was that command given to Am Yisrael? Was that command given to Moshe and to Am Yisrael before the Chet of the Egel, before they had the golden calf? Or was that a response to the golden calf? The Mishkan was a response to the golden calf, and the tzivui only occurs after the golden calf. If you take a look at the parshiot there, so the order is quite clear. You have Moshe going up to Har Sinai in order to receive the Torah for 40 days and 40 nights. At the very end of Parshat Mishpatim, the Perek Chaf Daled of Sefer Shemot, Perek Chaf Hey, the very next Perek, begins with Truma, with the command to build the Mishkan, and only in Perek Lamed Bet will the Torah talk about the Chet of the Egel. After the Chet of the Egel, we now have 3 prakim that talk about the Egel and the aftermath of the Egel, and then Perek Lamed Hey is Parshat Vayakel, which describes the actual construction of the Mishkan. So Perek Chaf Hey is the Tzivui, Lamed Bet is the Mishkan, is the Egel, Lamed Hey is the implementation. So it's pretty clear that that's the order. However, there's a very strong opinion in Chazal. Rashi takes it, and others do as well, that the tzivui of the Mishkan didn't occur in the first 40 days when Moshe was up on the mountain, but only occurs afterwards. Again, this is to begin to discuss why they would say that, but we don't have enough time to get into it. But basically, it's an application of the principle of Ein Mukdam Umeuchar BaTorah. Now, if I say that, so then I'm going to be liberal in the application of this principle. The Ramban is very conservative in this regard. He doesn't want to apply it unless he has to apply it. So the Ramban says explicitly that no, this is exactly what was commanded to Moshe when he was up in Har Sinai. He was commanded to put together the Mishkan. Say Parshat Truma, Parshat Tetzaveh were commanded to Moshe before the Egel. Then comes the Egel, then comes the implementation of the command that preceded it. And that's just one example. We'll perhaps talk about another example. So the Ramban as a whole is very conservative about the application. Here he doesn't have the choice, and he addresses it. So here in number 3, the Ramban says the following: B'shana shenit l'tzeitam me'eretz Yisrael b'chodesh Rishon, mikan amru chachamim, ein mukdam umeuchar b'Torah. But now, what's the reason for it? V'tam ha'ichur hazeh haya. Ki ka'asher ba'sefer hazeh revi'i lahaskir ha'mitzvot shenitztavu Yisrael b'midbar Sinai l'sha'atam. So Sefer Bamidbar is this 4th book. Is now is brought to tell us specifically the mitzvot of Bnei Yisrael in the desert l'sha'atam. Okay, that's an important word there, the sha'atam. Excuse me, why isn't it? There we go. Specifically, it's a description of mitzvot that did not apply for subsequent generations. It's something which is specific to the Midbar. Ratzah lahashlim inyan oel moed v'tikuno kol yemei hamidbar. V'hizkir tchila degalim u'makom mamad misharta v'tikun hamishmarot l'masa'ol l'chol avodot ha'oel. So basically, it's the first and foremost, we have to talk about the structure of the Jewish people for this march in the desert. That's the first thing that needs to be dealt with. So the first 8 prakim of Sefer Bamidbar talk about the encampment around the Mishkan in all of the detail that we have read the last 2 weeks, and begin reading in Parshat Bahalotcha before the story that we just read, because this is the framework and the context of Sefer Bamidbar, and after that, Achar Kach Shav Laskir As Harashi Yisrotam Shelo Yishkechu Mitzvot HaPesach. So only afterwards, once we've set the framework and set the context, so now we go back to the story of the Pesach. Now, basically what the Ramban is saying, that I have to look at, and this is I'll just, perhaps mention something. I might have mentioned this in a previous shiurim, something that I had the zchut. Now it's 35 years ago. I had the zchut of learning under Professor Nechama Leibovitz for a year, and one of the things that she said that she said many things in that year, but one of the things which really stuck in my mind was a definition of the distinction between pshat and drash. Was the normally speaking, people, if I were to just ask the question, how do you translate the word pshat? And frequently the answer will be the literal meaning of the text, the simple meaning of the text. And she felt that was at best an incomplete and perhaps even an incorrect answer. The correct answer from her perspective was that pshat is understanding things in context, whereas drash is understanding things out of context. Drash allows me to focus on ideas that the actual context of the literary piece, of this case of Tanakh or of Torah, do not allow me to focus on. And if I understand that distinction, and it's a very important thing to say because of it sheds tremendous light on what Chazal were trying to accomplish by introducing drash. And frequently people have almost a belittling view of drash because they expect or they assume that Chazal understood drash to be pshat. And they say, well, how could that possibly be? You take a look at this and it doesn't fit within the simple reading of the text or the literal reading of the text. And the answer to that is they were very much aware that that doesn't fit within the context of the parsha. If you were asking what is the pshat, they'd say, okay, this is the pshat, this is the context. Context, by the way, doesn't only mean the literary meaning of the words. Context can mean the historical context. Context can mean the literary context. Context can mean the sociological context. It also explains, by the way, why pshat itself can change. When I look at the pshat we'll say in the 21st century, it's not necessarily the way that the Rashbam looked at pshat in the 12th century. And it's not the way necessarily that a person who was living in the period of the Shoftim looked at pshat, because our contexts are different. So that's a different discussion. I'm just throwing it out there. The Ramban is saying, in effect, that if I'm going to use the idea of Ein Mukdam Umeuchar BaTorah, I'm going to be using it as a tool of pshat. I'm going to now say, I'm looking at Sefer Bamidbar in its context. And in the Sefer Bamidbar context, it's important to set the parameters of the Sefer. The parameters of the Sefer begin in the Midbar, and the parameters of the Sefer end in the Midbar as they go into Eretz Yisrael. And what happens in those 39 years is going to be basically framed by the structure of the Mishkan in the center, the structure of the encampment around it, the Levium in the middle, and that structure has to be put in the first and foremost, the beginning of the Sefer. That is the context. And now I could talk about incidents that might have occurred chronologically before, but within the context of Sefer Bamidbar, it's important to talk about them after I know about the structure itself. Okay, so now so this is so this is the, if you will, the pshat way of looking at the of Sefer Bamidbar. He now mentions al dat rabotenu lo nahaga bidbar ela b'shana zo bilvad. This last line that the Ramban says here, and I'll just change the color so just to make it clear, but this last line here, where the Ramban is saying that this is a different incident, a different way of looking at it. When our Chachamim say that they didn't bring the Korban Pesach, there's no explicit statement to that fact that the Korban Pesach wasn't brought in year 3, 4, 5, 22. It may have been brought, and the Torah just feels that it's not an important detail for us to know. Chazal understood that they didn't bring it because it's not mentioned, and it's going to be mentioned again in Sefer Yehoshua. That may be the case, but that's not, from at least from the Ramban's perspective, that's not the pshat reason to explain why the Torah should use a different chronology. This is as I said, this is a wide machloket between Rashi and the Ramban. But having said it, Rashi also, I just want to focus on these words here in green. The lama lo patchu bezo, right? Why didn't the Torah use it? So Rashi, by saying that, is saying that when I look at Ein Mukdam Umeuchar BaTorah, I'm also looking at it, if you will, from a pshat perspective. I'm also going to be looking at it from the perspective of why is there a change in context? Because the most obvious context should be the context of the chronology. And if I'm going to change the context of the chronology, there needs to be a reason for it. The reason might not be the context itself. It might be in order to teach me a different lesson, but I'm only going to be using this tool if there is a clear need and a clear reason to do so. It's not something to be applied willy-nilly in an arbitrary manner. And as I said, even though the Rashi himself in his commentary to the Gemara in Pesachim, also here in green, lo hikpida Torah, right? So Rashi seems to be a broader approach in Pesachim, but here he is limiting it to only incidents where there is a reason for this. Now, before I get into a broader idea of the notion here, I just want to take another application, which I've spoken about. We were giving this shir a week ago before Shavuot. It would also be applicable. So it's the week after Shavuot. We could talk about this incident as well. And here's another place where perhaps, and I emphasize the word perhaps, Ein Mukdam Umeuchar BaTorah applies, and it's a machloket amongst the Parshanim. It's a machloket already amongst the Tanaim. I'm referring to the question of how to view the Sefer Perek Chavdalid in Sefer Shemot. And the question is the following: in Perek Yutet, chapter 19 of Sefer Shemot, the Torah tells us the story of Ma'amad Har Sinai.
Very good.
Excuse me? Someone? Ma'amad Har Sinai, of the revelation at Sinai. Then the Torah in Perek Chaf is the description of the Aseret HaDibrot. Perek Chaf Aleph and the rest of Parshat Mishpatim is Perek Chaf Aleph, Chaf Bet, Chaf Gimel are laws that presumably were given at that point in time. That's those three prakim. And then you have Perek Chaf Daled, where you have a story again and of Ma'amad Har Sinai, of what happens when the Jews are at the foot of Har Sinai. The stories are very different. Now is not the time to get into the differences between Perek Yutet and Perek Chaf Daled. And the question arises, and this is, by the way, Perek Chaf Daled is where the Torah tells us the only time where the Torah uses the term Naaseh v'Nishma, which we all assume happens before the giving of the Aseret HaDibrot, even though it is actually stated in the Torah after the Aseret HaDibrot. So the Midrash is aware of this, and the Midrash says the following. Vayomer, number 5. Vayomer Hashem al Moshe lech el ha'am v'kidashtem hayom. So God tells Moshe in Perek Yud Tet, right? This is I didn't bring the prakim in front of us, but here it's Perek Yud Tet, that God says to Moshe, go tell the Am and to purify themselves. When did this happen? Ze Yom Rivi'i. So this is the fourth day, meaning we'll say Daled Sivan. Okay, so that is the 4th of Sivan. Umeuchar, because it says Kidashtem Hayom Umeuchar, that's the pasuk. Ze Yom Chamishi. Vehayu Nechonim, that's on the 5th day. Vehayu Nechonim liyom hashlishi, Ze Yom Shishi Shebo Nitna Torah. Okay, so this is the framework here that we're dealing with the 4th, the 5th, and ultimately the 6th of Sivan. That's happening Perek Yutet. Now the Midrash asks, Uma asa Moshe b'chamishi. What did Moshe do on that 5th day? That's the question. What did Moshe do on the 5th day? And the answer that the Midrash gives is taken from not Perek Yud Tet, but rather from Perek Chaf Daled. Right. So here is the source that's going to be said, where we say that Moshe Hishkim baboker ubana mizbeach tachat hahar. He builds he wakes up early in the morning and he builds a mizbeach under or at the foot of the mountain, and that is Shne'emar, as the pasuk says in Perek Chaf Daled, Vayashkem Moshe baboker vayiven tachat hahar. And then there's a description of what he did. Divrei Rabbi Yehuda. Now, as Rabbi Yehuda says that this is an incident of Ein Mukdam Umeuchar BaTorah. And then there's different details which we won't get into at that point. Vayikach, we'll skip to the next paragraph. Vayikach Sefer Abrit Vayikra Ba'oznei Ha'am. So this is also a pasuk there. Aval lo shamanu mehechan kara ba'ozneihem. We don't know what was written in that book of the covenant that Moshe read from in Perek Chaf Daled. So Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Yehuda says what was written there, mitchilat Breshit va'ad kan. That so here there's a Rabbi Yossi says that he read a reading of the chapter which is basically from the beginning of Sefer Breshit bara Elokim, through Shmot Chaf Daled. Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Yehuda is viewing it chronologically. And the Rabbi, on the other hand, says, no, mitzvat nishtaveh Adam Harishon, that the Sefer HaBrit is everything up to Perek Yud Tet, without getting into the details now. Basically, here, where the Torah doesn't do us the favor of what it Midbar, giving us the chronology. So here, because as I said, Sefer Bamidbar, the Torah gives the dates themselves. Here, the Torah just tells us the story and tells us a story of them standing at the mountain. And you could read it as two separate incidents, one that occurred before and one that occurs after, or you could read it as basically a retelling of what occurred in Perek Yutet as opposed to what occurs in Perek Chavdalid, that they are a Rashomon type of way of looking at the story, that from different vantage points, you see the story differently, and the Torah separates it in order to allow us to see the different vantage points. And then Perek Chavdalid is not written in the right chronology, or the chronology that I would expect. It's out of order. So you could read it either way, and this leads to a machloket, or a different ways of understanding the text. And some of the Tanaim view it chronologically, and some of the Tanaim view it out of the chronology. We'll skip Rabbi Yishmael right now, just to point out that this argument is brought up by Rashi and the Ramban, another example of that principle that I spoke about before, where Rashi takes this idea, and he says explicitly, Arba b'Sivan nemar lo alei parsha zo nemra. Excuse me, I'll read it. I'll read Rashi in the right order. Rashi says, El Moshe Amar alei parsha zo nemra kodem aseret hadibrot. Right. So Rashi says Perek Chavdalid chronologically occurred before the giving of the Aseret Hadibrot, which was in Perek Chav. The Ramban, who, as we said, is much more conservative in the application of Ein Mukdam Umeuchar BaTorah, explicitly and unequivocally, Hinei Parshiot Kulan Baot Kahogen. All of this is brought in the proper order, and he references the idea of Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda in that piece of the Gemara. I'm not going to read it inside right now because I want to get to the subsequent sources. I'll just point out that the Nitziv in number 7 in the Hamek Davar, so he says that the Ramban hit ametz. Right? I'm not going to read all of it inside. Read part of it inside. Ramban hit ametz. He worked hard to get everything to fit in the proper chronological order, but but what can you do? He says the Ramban was wrong, that the overwhelming majority of opinions in Chazal understand these parshiot out of order, and that should be the way that we look at it as well. So the Nitziv has no problem in understanding the Ramban's rationale in trying to limit the scope of this notion of Ein Mukdam Umeuchar BaTorah, but he says we shouldn't be so scared, and that it needs to be applied more liberally. With this in mind, and I just want to come back because I want to, if I have time, I want to reference back to this. I just want to take a look at the opinion of, again, what was in the Sefer HaBrit, what was in the Book of the Covenant that Moshe reads either before or after the giving of Matan Torah. So the most radical reading of this is actually what occurs in the end of Sefer Vayikra. I shouldn't say occurs because it's ahistorical, but what's brought to us in the end of Sefer Vayikra. Rabbi Yishmael Omer, B'tchilat ha'inyan. Look at that word. I mean, I read this, every time I read this, he says, B'tchilat ha'inyan, the beginning of the story. Right? I just want to change the color so it stands out a little bit more. The B'tchilat ha'inyan, the beginning of the story, Mahu Omer, and he says, what's at the beginning? What's at the beginning is Sefer Vayikra. Vayikra, Perek Chavhei, the very end of Sefer Vayikra, which is, we're told at Har Sinai, and the stories of the halachot of Shemitah, that's at the beginning. V'shavta aretz Shabbat Hashem, all of that, all the shmitot, and the brachot and the klalot. That's very important. But at the very end, it's all said explicitly, Behar Sinai. That, Rabbi Yishmael says, is what's written here. And then, Besof ha'inyan, what should be understood as the end is in Sefer Shemot. The Perek Chavav, Eila hachukim v'hamishpatim v'hatorot. This is the end of the story, even though it's brought a full sefer before, not in the end of Sefer Vayikra, but towards the end of Sefer Shemot. And the rationale for it is the following: Amar lahem, after Bnei Yisrael 7 Nishma, Moshe Rabbeinu tells them. What does Moshe Rabbeinu tell them? The Harei Atem Kshurim Anuvim Utfusim. You are bound, tied, and fully responsible for what you have just accepted. Machar bo v'kiblu alechem et hamitzvot kulan. Tomorrow, because remember, according to this way of reading it, this Perek Chavdalet is being stated to Bnei Yisrael on the 5th day of Sivan. Tomorrow, on the 6th day of Sivan, when you hear the Aseret HaDibrot, you're going to get the full scope of these mitzvot, and you are trapped into that. You have accepted it. You're bound by it. Now, of course, you have to ask why. So you could again go to the chronology. Not the chronology. You could go to the pshat and try to understand. But why was this placed here? Why doesn't it place it? Why is it placed at the end of Sefer Vayikra? Why doesn't it place it in Perek Chavdalid and tell us this right then and there? Why read it here? Right. So I'm going to leave that question hanging for a moment, and we'll hopefully come back to it. We don't have much time left, so hopefully within the next 15 minutes before the end of this year, we will come back to it. I want to take a step back, because until now, just to recap, we've seen how the Torah has used this concept of Ein Mukdam Umeuchar BaTorah, and the Torah uses it explicitly. We've seen a machloket between Rashi and the Ramban and others as to what extent do we want to apply this kind of concept of lacking of chronology. Neither Rashi nor the Ramban are interested in using it in an arbitrary type of way. The Ramban is conservative in his application, and he says if the Torah is going to use it, so the Torah is only going to use it when it serves the pshat. If it doesn't serve the pshat, so then you have to make the assumption that everything that the Torah presents to you is being presented in the proper chronology. If you find an incident where the proper chronology does not service the pshat, does not service the context of the text, then you have to assume that the Torah has a very good reason to present things out of the chronology in order to allow the pshat, in order to service the pshat better. We will occasionally change the chronology. That's the Ramban, the conservative approach. The more liberal approach of Rashi and others is basically to say that the Torah has introduced this idea of Ein Mukdam Umeuchar BaTorah. I can apply it more liberally if I feel, but I have to emphasize the if I feel that there is something to be served by presenting the text out of the order, but not necessarily specifically in a very clear cut context, the way that the Ramban is saying, but in a more liberal fashion. And I can perhaps, for example, use an idea to teach me that this is big nutan, this is to the denigration of Am Yisrael, with regard to the Korban Pesach, we don't want to start the Sefer with that story, because then we would assume that that's something which is praiseworthy, and it's not something which is praiseworthy, and therefore it's pushed up by 8 prakim to Perek Tet. So that's the two different approaches. I want to try to look at perhaps a more radical application based on our understanding of time. And here I want to take two non-Jewish authors. One of them speaking specifically with regard to Jews, Thomas Cahill, a historian who's written about basically the contributions of different societies to human history back in the 90s. So he wrote a book called The Gift of the Jews, in which he wrote about the specific contributions of Jews throughout human history. And specifically, and this is perhaps the most important, from his perspective, the most important contribution that we've given to the world. Obviously, we know there are many, but here he says the following. Number 8, if we make use of what hints remain in the prehistorical and proto-historical record, we must come to the unexpected conclusion that their inventions and discoveries made in the aid of their survival and prosperity, tools and fire, agricultural, beasts of burden, irrigation, the wheel, did not seem to them innovations. They were gifts from beyond the world, somehow part of the eternal. All evidence points to there having been in the earliest religious thought a vision of the cosmos that was profoundly cyclical. The assumptions that early man made about the world were in all their essentials little different from the assumptions that later and more sophisticated societies like Greece and India would make in a more elaborate manner. As Henry Shaw Push says of the Greek thought in his seminal Man and Time, no event is unique. Nothing is enacted but once. Every event has been enacted, is enacted, and will be enacted perpetually. So it's basically this concept that there is this cycle, the notion of what we might call Gilgulim of later application in the Jewish context. The idea that there is this constant repetition that goes on, or retelling, revisiting different ideas. So this is the way that man thought. That's the given. And then he says the Jews were the first people to break out of this circle, to find a new way of thinking and experience a new way of understanding and feeling the world, so much so that it may be said with some justice is that theirs is the only new ideas that human beings have ever had. A very, very powerful statement. But basically what it's saying is that the way that our worldview is so profoundly affected by this, that we think of Ein Mukdam Umeuchar BaTorah, we think of a lack of chronology as being problematic. We expect there to be a chronology. The ancient world and many societies, in today's society, I guess most prominently being Hindu thought, doesn't view the world chronologically speaking. You can make a good argument, and others have made an argument that this is the source, if you will, for scientific development as well. And as once I understand, let's take an idea of what chronology means. Chronology, also we could talk about a beginning point of a Bereshit bara Elokim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. In the Greek world, so the world had always existed in the Greek, and that was even accepted in the scientific community until the Big Bang had won over scientific thought. So we're talking about into the first half of the 20th century. The assumption was the static state of the universe. But there's a beginning and there is an end. We have a destiny. We build towards something. So this is something which is that we're moving forward to. And this is all something which is this is all something that, at least according to Cahill, is something that that the Torah is what introduces this idea. Once I have this notion, so then I can talk about, okay, looking at progress on a scientific level, looking to try to move things forward, to be examining the world, even things that we might view as being a challenge or a view of the world. If we talk about evolution, let's say, so that very word, evolution and revolution, are words that only make sense within the context of a chronology, of basically of having time. However, right, the question is, well, is that the only way of looking at time? That might be the, if you will, certainly the way that from our perspective, and I think the Torah's perspective, is the pshat way, if you will, of taking a look at time. But here, this is just a piece that I came across 10 years ago or so, where in the New York Times column, pop philosophy column, The Stone. So Espen Hammer, a Norwegian philosopher, so he wrote the following. He wrote that others like Heidegger have tried to show that clock time is not as fundamental as we often think it is. In addition to the objective time of the clock, they argue, they are temporalities of human experience and engagement that, while often ignored, deserve to be explored and analyzed. But he goes on to explain that idea. Perhaps clock time is one mode of temporality amongst others. If so, then it is not obvious that clock time should always be our preferred mode of temporal self-interpretation. Perhaps we have to recognize a tension in human life between the demands of clock time and those other temporalities, between the clock or the calendar and life as it is truly experienced. Rather, human life is a continuous and highly complex negotiation of existing commitments and remembrances with future demands and expectations. So we can, basically, he's trying to say is that we can look at the world as A follows B, and B follows C, and C follows D, all the way down to Z. Or we can be looking at the world, and we have to look at the world in that way, but at the same time, we have to look at the world in terms of what it is that life is all about, and that our memories, if we think about in terms of our memories, things that occurred long in the past are as alive to us in our own minds as they were, as to use the term, as if they happened yesterday, or even if they're happening right now, and our responsibilities for the future are also going to be collapsing into the sense of if you will, the present. And he gives a couple of examples of this. That basically are narratives, right? Human beings structure their lives around narratives. Some narratives will tend to remain in the foreground of one's engagements and orientations. These will include things like our self-conception or relationship with others. Others, such as how we organize our day, will be more rarely reflected upon. I could give an account of how I organize my day, but that would typically be to a child or someone with scant knowledge of my own culture. By contrast, stories about our relationships always tend to be matters of reflection, rethinking, and revision. So the idea that he's trying to say is that the way that we structure our lives is not always chronologically. If we're forced to it, we'll say, oh yes, that occurred, if we remember. Sometimes we might, we may even forget when things actually occurred, because we're looking at our lives from a question of their significance, and rather than from their mere chronology. The Sfat Emet, I think, makes a similar point, specifically with regard to our discussion of Ein Mukdam Umeuchar BaTorah. Here in number 9, the Sfat Emet says the following: Ha'inyan hu ki agam sheyesh dvarim shehem achana Kimo ale hachana lepri. There are things which are preparatory stages. For example, the leaves of a tree that come out before the fruit of the tree is born. V'chein b'chol ma'asei ha'olam zeh hachana lezeh kimo domem letzomeach v'tzomeach lechai, etc., etc. In other words, there are different stages. Here he's hinting, if you will, to a certain evolution in of itself, but an evolution in a 19th century way of looking at evolution, that there is a constant move towards a more complex and a more complete stage than the stage that preceded it. Mikol makom, kol ze b'derech hitlabshut hateva, aval mitzad koch hapoel emet, shepuolato emet, yesh elakut b'chol davar mitzad amitut haborei yitbarach shemo hamaveheko. So God is he's referring to God as truth. And truth is beyond time. You can take a sense in the following way. In this regard, I think that our modern Einsteinian view of time is very helpful here. Time before Einstein was something that the entire universe was the river of time that was moving forward. Because of Einstein, so now we view time as being another dimension. So the same way that we view God as being outside of our dimensions, our physical dimensions, the three dimensions that we refer to, God is also outside of the fourth dimension, outside of time. It's something that we can't really wrap our minds around any more than we can think of really understand a total incorporeal being, because we have everything that we live in our existence is governed by the dimensions that we live in. So it's very difficult, if not impossible, for us to understand a notion or a being that's outside of those dimensions. But the same way that God is outside of the physical dimensions, he's outside of the temporal dimension as well. So truth then, and God is truth with a capital T. So truth then, what the Sfas Emes is saying, is also outside of time. And that means outside of chronology. There is no time that is limiting the truth. There is no space that's limiting the truth. Torah emet, and ultimately, Torah is the Torah of truth. B'Torah Hashem tmima zeu b'chidush shleimut she'en lecha o Torah she'en bo kol Torah mitzad achdut ha'emet. In that regard, every single letter of Torah, if it's Torah's emet, so it incorporates everything. There is no, we've broken the dimensions. We've broken the context of the pshat, as it were. This is what Chazal meant when they said that there isn't a chronology. Right? So everything has the entire Torah has everything in it, or every part of the Torah has everything in it, and that is what's going on in Mukdam Umeuchar BaTorah. So what I would like to posit in these last 3 minutes is that basically the idea of, to go back to the first source of the notion of what lelamdecha, those 3 words in blue, that the Torah, that the Midrash is saying to teach you, she'en Mukdam Umeuchar BaTorah. I think we can understand the Midrash be saying the following. It's true that the pshat, the context, has to be governed by chronology. The drash, if you will, what the Sfat Emet call the emet, doesn't have to be governed by chronology. The same way that the drash is able to draw out much deeper truths because by comparing psukim in Bamidbar to Psukim in Tehillim, for argument's sake, and viewing the entire corpus of Tanakh as one garment, and which I can pull one thread in one direction, and it pulls that same thread in a completely different area of that garment, of wormholes that you can move in this universe of Tanakh. The same thing holds true in terms of time. If I take, just to use example, because I've run out of time, I guess ein Mukdam Umeuchar b'shiurim, but having run out of the time, so I'll just take just the example of the Rashi that we started with, and the idea of the Genutan. You can take a look at this idea of the Genutan of Yisrael, and you can say, you know what the Genutan is? Well, the Genutan is they never brought another Korban Pesach. We don't want it to start Sefer Bamidbar, because after all, that's, would give would either highlight the fact that this is the only one, and we don't want to highlight, we don't want to draw, we don't want to put a spotlight on their failings, or it might give a sense of what, of the negative. That could very well be. You can also look at it as saying the following, what is the idea of Perek Tet, of Sefer Bamidbar? Perek Tet is that I have this story where, on the one hand, people are desperately interested in bringing a Korban Pesach. Am Yisrael gets the tzivui. God tells Moshe, bring the Korban Pesach, v'yasu b'nei Yisrael et Pesach b'moado. You're not supposed to have left that Korban Pesach in Egypt. You're supposed to take it out with you, and now you're supposed to have this Korban as as your Korban. And the people respond. How do they respond? They respond that anachnu tzmeim lenefesh adam. We are impure right now. Lama yigara. Why should we be left out? We desperately want to be included in this mitzvah, but more than just the mitzvah, in this statement of, in fact, it's even called Korban Ha'am, the Korban of the people as a whole. This is what we want to be part of. That's what the Am Yisrael is saying in those words. And what does Moshe respond to them based on what God responds? Is yes, you can bring this Korban outside of time. You don't have to bring it on the 14th of Nisan. You can bring it on the 14th of Iyar as well. The concept is a concept outside of time. And now, once I say that this was a unique incident, that Bnei Yisrael never brought another Korban Pesach, so what they are saying is that they never had that experience again. They never, in effect, all of the people were a sense of Tmeim Lenefesh Adam for the following 38 years. They pulled themselves away from it. They were in a state of not being part of the Korban Ha'am. They were in a state of not being part of the Korban. It's not just simply a problem of that we don't want to highlight the fact that Bnei Yisrael only did this once. It becomes something which is much deeper and almost ontological in terms of the nature of what Bnei Yisrael were in the Midbar and what we should not become, that we should not be part of that. And so the Torah steps away from the chronology to tell us an eternal truth. The eternal truth being the question of how you are, how do you take the messages of Korban Pesach and how do you incorporate them into your life, into the life of the Am. And the messages of Korban Pesach were not incorporated into the life of the Jews in the Midbar. And to start Midbar, Sefer Bamidbar, with that story would be to lay lie to that deeper truth that Korban Pesach was not a value which was able to hold through into year 3, 4, and beyond. And only then becomes part of the Am Yisrael story again when they enter Eretz Yisrael. So here, just taking that one idea, by taking it out of the chronology, it turns it into a notion which can become timeless. So here, I think that this idea of Ein Mukdam Umeuchar BaTorah becomes a very important idea. And perhaps should be applied even more liberally than what Rashi wants to say. As long as I'm using Ein Mukdam Umeuchar BaTorah within the context of Pshat, so then we can take the Ramban's approach and be very conservative. We can take Rashi's approach and be more liberal. But once we, and I think this is what the Midrash may have been trying to say in the first place, if I understand this Midrash correctly, that the Torah is saying, "L'lamdecha, l'lamdecha, l'lamdecha," to teach you, to teach you, to teach you. This is something that you're able to do. Don't be limited by the pshat. Don't be limited by the chronology of our lives. Look back at what the Sfat Emet called the Torah Emet. Look at that ultimate value as well, not in place of the pshat, but parallel to the pshat. And then the Torah, because I understand that Ein Mukdam Umeuchar BaTorah, so then Torah Hashem becomes Tamima. Then it becomes whole as well. Okay, Shabbat Shalom.
Question? Simple question. What do you do with Moshe Kibul Torah Sinai?
Okay. If you could make the question a little more complex and explained.
Or it's as complex as possible. Did Moshe hear every word in the Torah on Har Sinai? Did he hear the story of Dusim Vaviram in advance? When that ties in with this complex, I think it's a wonderful shot to pick special cases that have to be illuminated L'dor Dorot. But you see anybody like modern times say, what? You don't believe that Moshe received all the Torah from beginning to end, maybe the last 8 verses or whatever it is an exception. What do you do with that?
Well, you're touching upon a broader issue. Maybe not a broader issue, but certainly a different issue, a parallel issue. When it comes to that question, so that is a machloket going back to at least to the time of Chazal, whether everything was given at Sinai or whether it was Parshiot Nikru. Even if you take the idea that everything was given at Sinai, it doesn't mean, I don't think anyone ever thought that it meant that, if Moshe had fast forwarded, he finds out that he's hitting the rock. Because, he just needs, there's no way to avoid it because it's written in the script.
Yeah.
And that's what he's going to do. I don't think that's anyone ever understood it that way. That what it means is that the mitzvot, the laws were given at Sinai, and that then Moshe at different times. Otherwise, you can't understand Vayikra, where it comes from the Oel Moed, when let's say the korbanot of the shlamim, the halachot of the shlamim, etc. Then it becomes a question of what is the proper time to reveal those mitzvot. The core of the Torah, or the entirety even of the Torah, is given at Sinai to Moshe Rabbeinu, but it's only, according to that approach, it's only going to be Moshe is only going to tell the rest of the Torah later on. That is a little bit more difficult to understand when you're reading the Torah, just reading our parsha. If that were the case, so then Moshe should have known the halachot of Pesach Sheni. Right? He should have known them. He should have known
everything
to Am Yisrael. Right? He shouldn't have had to wait for God to tell him, oh yes, there's a Pesach Sheni. right? So even there, it's going to be a question of how that, does Moshe really know everything, right? Even that, but and there are other examples as well. Benot Tzlocha, let's say.
I would not have wished on Moshe Parsha Ketuvot.
I'm sorry?
I wouldn't, your Parsha say a list of names, but I'm just saying in education today, anybody doesn't believe that every word is given to Moshe and Sinai is an Apikoros.
Well, I don't know whether that's totally the truth. That's another discussion. I think if anything, certainly in our circles. So there's there's a more willingness to accept things that would have been considered to be apikorsot a couple of decades ago, as in terms of openness towards biblical criticism and the like. But even in taking the other idea, so it's not so much that if it wasn't given at Sinai that you're an apikoros. It's more if you don't believe that by Arvot Moav everything is in place, then you're the apikoros. Just to take the midrash that we learned earlier, right? What Rabbi Yehuda Nasi said. So when he said that you don't need this parsha to teach me ein Mukdam Umeuchar BaTorah because you already have it with regard to the man. So it's clear that he's understanding that pasuk was written at the end of the 40 years. Right? Because otherwise it would be Mukdam. It wouldn't be ein Mukdam Umeuchar BaTorah. It would be the chronology. So it's clear that he's understanding that pasuk was something that was inserted at the end of the 40 years. And Moshe is writing it down, knowing that they're still eating the man and that they will eat the man until Yeshua brings them into Eretz Canaan, a few weeks after his passing away, Moshe's passing away. So even if you, as I said, I think that the machloket as to what comes from Sinai as opposed to what is given is a question more of what does Moshe know, but only reveals later,
or what was given,
or what or perhaps Moshe himself doesn't know it until God tells him in the Ohel Moed, or in our Moav in the 40th year. But but those were not told to Moshe until that time. So that's the scope of the machloket. But everyone would agree that I think that the final product is only going to be written in the last few days and weeks of the 40 years.
But there was no prophecies.
Right. Well, right. According to as I said, there's no way that you can understand that the historical events were told to Moshe, and that Moshe had that, had the script, as it were, in the Sefer Torah. He didn't have it. Otherwise, the Meraglim wouldn't have happened, or the Egel. These things.
Those are all the good arguments for showing that you cannot really believe that everything was given at Sinai.
Not every word. No, I don't think anyone could ever say that. As I said, they could talk about the legal content being given at Sinai.
The legal content or the moral concepts.
Right, and the moral concepts, but not the historical storyline. And the storyline, of course, impacts on the moral concepts, and sometimes even impacts on the halachic concepts.
That's what Mukdam and BaTorah means. That basically the moral principles that we have today, some of them were given earlier, that people recognize. It's, I wish that more people understood what you talk about.
Okay, I'll do my best. Okay, so Shabbat Shalom to everyone.
Shabbat Shalom, and thank you very much. Hello? Okay, one second, I'm just closing my computer.